Welcome to a journey through the lost workshops and forgotten laboratories of the ancient world. For the next few hours, we will explore inventions so remarkable, so ahead of their time, that their very existence challenges our assumptions about what ancient peoples could achieve. These are not the famous innovations, not the wheel, not the printing press, not gunpowder. These are the obscure tools, the strange devices, the technological marvels that were created, used, and then lost to history, sometimes for millennia. If you enjoy these deep explorations of lost knowledge, please like and subscribe to support our channel. Our journey begins not in a museum or a library, but at the bottom of the sea. It is October 1900, and a group of Greek sponge divers are working off the coast of the small island of Antikythera, between Crete and mainland Greece. They are experienced divers, men who make their living descending to dangerous depths to harvest natural sponges from the seabed. But today, one diver surfaces with a story that seems impossible. He has found a wreck, an ancient shipwreck, and among the debris he saw something extraordinary: bronze statues, marble figures, treasures scattered across the ocean floor. The Greek government organizes a salvage operation, and over the following months, divers bring up statue after statue, amphora after amphora, the cargo of what was clearly a wealthy merchant vessel that sank sometime in the 1st century BCE. The finds are spectacular: bronze sculptures of philosophers and heroes, marble statues of gods and athletes, jewelry, coins, glassware. The ship was carrying luxury goods, probably bound for Rome, when it met its end in these treacherous waters. But among all these treasures, one object stands out for its sheer strangeness. It is a corroded lump of bronze and wood, encrusted with 2,000 years of marine growth, easily overlooked among the more obviously valuable finds. When it is brought to the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, no one quite knows what to make of it. It looks like nothing so much as a piece of scrap metal, a random conglomeration of bronze fragments fused together by time and seawater. For decades it sits in storage, catalogued but not understood. Occasionally a scholar examines it, notes the presence of what appear to be gear wheels within the corrosion, makes some vague speculation about it being a navigational instrument or an astrolabe, and moves on to more comprehensible artifacts. The consensus, to the extent that anyone thinks about it at all, is that it is probably just debris, perhaps fragments from several different objects, accidentally fused together. But in the 1950s, a British science historian named Derek de Solla Price becomes obsessed with this strange object. He obtains permission to study it intensively, using X-rays to peer inside the corroded mass without disturbing it. What he discovers is so extraordinary that many of his colleagues initially refuse to believe him. The object, now known as the Antikythera mechanism, is a machine. Not a simple machine, but an elaborate mechanical computer consisting of at least 30 interlocking bronze gears of varying sizes, all precisely calibrated, all working together to perform complex calculations. It is, in essence, an analog computer for calculating astronomical positions and predicting eclipses, built with a level of mechanical sophistication that should not exist for another 1,000 years. Let us understand what this means. The Antikythera mechanism was built sometime around 100 BCE, during the Hellenistic period, when Greek science and engineering had reached remarkable heights. But even accounting for Greek mathematical and astronomical knowledge, the mechanism represents a leap in mechanical engineering that seems almost impossible. The gearwork is extraordinarily precise. The teeth are triangular and evenly spaced. The gears mesh perfectly. The whole assembly works as a unified system. The device was operated by turning a hand crank on the side. As the crank turned, the gears rotated at different rates, their ratios carefully calculated to mirror the movements of celestial bodies as understood by ancient astronomy. Dials on the front and back displayed the positions of the sun, moon, and planets. The mechanism could predict the dates of eclipses years in advance. It could show the phases of the moon. It incorporated the irregular orbit of the moon, something that requires sophisticated mathematics to calculate. The level of miniaturization is startling. The gears are small, precisely machined, fitted together with extraordinary skill. Whoever built this device understood not just astronomy and mathematics, but mechanical engineering at a level we associate with clockmakers of the Renaissance, not with ancient Greeks. The mechanism represents a tradition of precision instrument making that must have existed for generations. No one creates something this sophisticated without predecessors, without accumulated knowledge of gear cutting and mechanical design. And yet, nothing like it appears in the historical record. Greek and Roman writers mention many inventions, many clever devices, but nothing that clearly describes a geared mechanism of this complexity. We have no instruction manuals for building such devices, no descriptions of workshops where they were made, no mentions of other examples. The Antikythera mechanism stands alone, a technological marvel that should not exist, preserved only by the accident of shipwreck and the luck of discovery. What happened to this technology? Why did it disappear? These are questions without definitive answers, but we can speculate. The mechanism was clearly expensive to build. The precision work, the bronze, the astronomical knowledge required, all of this would have made it accessible only to the very wealthy. It was probably a luxury item, perhaps commissioned by a wealthy patron interested in astronomy, or perhaps intended as a gift to impress a powerful person in Rome. Such luxury technologies are fragile in more ways than the physical. They depend on skilled craftsmen, on stable patronage, on the transmission of specialized knowledge from master to apprentice. When the Roman Empire entered its long decline, when trade networks broke down, when cities shrank and wealth decreased, specialized crafts like this were among the first casualties. The knowledge of how to build such mechanisms was probably lost within a few generations of the mechanism's creation. But the Antikythera mechanism tells us something profound about ancient capabilities. It reminds us that the ancient world was not primitive, not technologically backward in the way we sometimes imagine. The Greeks and Romans had metalworking skills that were in some ways not matched again until the modern era. They understood principles of engineering and mathematics that we tend to associate with much later periods. They were capable of creating devices of startling sophistication when they had the motivation and resources to do so. Let us leave the Antikythera mechanism in its glass case in Athens, where it remains one of the most mysterious and remarkable artifacts of the ancient world, and travel forward in time and eastward in space to China during the Han Dynasty. It is the year 132 CE, and the astronomer and inventor Zhang Heng is presenting his latest creation to the imperial court. Zhang Heng is one of the great polymaths of ancient China, an astronomer, mathematician, engineer, poet, and statesman. He has already created an improved armillary sphere for tracking the movements of celestial bodies. He has written extensively on cosmology and has refined the calculation of pi. But his new invention is something unprecedented, a device for detecting earthquakes. Earthquakes are a serious problem in China. The country sits on geologically active terrain, and destructive earthquakes occur with frightening regularity. But in the vast expanse of the Han Empire, it can take weeks or months for news of a distant earthquake to reach the capital. By the time the emperor learns of the disaster and can send aid, many victims have already perished. What Zhang Heng proposes is a device that can detect earthquakes immediately, indicating both that an earthquake has occurred and the direction from which the seismic waves came. The device he has created is extraordinary. A large bronze vessel, approximately 6 feet in diameter, shaped like a wine jar. Around the outside of the vessel are 8 dragon heads, each facing one of the 8 cardinal directions. In the mouth of each dragon is a bronze ball. Below each dragon, sitting on the ground, is a bronze toad with its mouth open, positioned to catch the ball if it falls. Inside the vessel is a mechanism. We do not have the original, so we can only infer its design from descriptions. Probably consisting of a pendulum suspended in the center, connected by a system of levers to the 8 dragons. When seismic waves from an earthquake shake the device, the pendulum swings in the direction from which the waves came. This swing triggers a mechanism that opens the mouth of the dragon facing that direction, allowing the bronze ball to fall into the waiting toad's mouth with a loud clang, alerting observers to both the fact of the earthquake and its direction. According to historical records, the device worked. In 138 CE, one of the balls fell from the Western Dragon, but no earthquake had been felt in the capital. Court officials were skeptical. Perhaps the device was faulty. But several days later, news arrived of a major earthquake in Gansu province, hundreds of miles to the west. The seismoscope had detected seismic waves too subtle to be felt by human beings at such a distance, but strong enough to trigger its sensitive mechanism. Think about what this represents. Zhang Heng created a device that could detect physical phenomena beyond human sensory range. He understood that earthquakes generate waves that propagate through the earth. He designed a mechanism sensitive enough to detect these waves, but stable enough not to be triggered by ordinary vibrations from traffic, wind, or other environmental factors. This is sophisticated seismology, sophisticated mechanical engineering, achieved in the 2nd century CE. Like the Antikythera mechanism, Zhang Heng's seismoscope was lost. We have detailed descriptions of it in historical texts, but no surviving examples, no complete plans for its construction. Modern scholars have built reconstructions based on the descriptions, demonstrating that the basic principle is sound. But the original device, with whatever refinements and clever details Zhang Heng incorporated, is gone. Why did this technology disappear? Again, we can only speculate. The seismoscope was a specialized device requiring skilled bronze workers to construct, and probably requiring maintenance and calibration. It was built for a specific patron, the imperial court, and when that patronage ended, either through changes in imperial interest or through the broader collapse that eventually overtook the Han dynasty, the knowledge of how to build such devices was lost. But Zhang Heng's seismoscope represents something important about Chinese technological achievement. Ancient China was, in many ways, the most technologically advanced civilization in the world. Chinese inventors created paper, movable type printing, the magnetic compass, sophisticated astronomical instruments, advanced metallurgy, and countless other innovations. Many of these technologies were created centuries or even millennia before they appeared in the West. Yet much of this knowledge was lost, sometimes multiple times. China's history includes periods of extraordinary achievement, followed by periods of chaos, invasion, and collapse. During these collapses, specialized knowledge was often lost. Libraries burned, craftsmen died without passing on their skills, wealthy patrons disappeared, and with them the support for luxury technologies and specialized crafts. Let us move now from China to the Mediterranean world, and from seismology to a different kind of invention, one that seems almost frivolous, but that demonstrates surprising sophistication in applied physics. It is sometime in the 1st century CE, in Roman Egypt, specifically in the great city of Alexandria. Alexandria is the intellectual capital of the ancient world, home to the famous library and museum, where scholars from across the empire gather to study mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and engineering. Among these scholars is a man named Hero, sometimes called Heron, an engineer and mathematician who writes extensively on mechanics, optics, and pneumatics. Hero is interested in practical applications of scientific principles. He writes instruction manuals on surveying, on warfare machines, on mechanical devices. But he is also interested in what we might call recreational mathematics, clever devices that demonstrate principles without necessarily having practical applications. One of his creations is a vending machine. Yes, a vending machine, in the 1st century CE. Here is how it worked. Outside a temple in Alexandria, there was a device for selling holy water. A worshipper would insert a bronze coin into a slot at the top of the machine. The coin would fall onto one end of a balance lever inside the machine, which would open a valve, which would allow a measured amount of water to flow out from a reservoir into a cup held by the worshipper. After a few seconds, the coin would slide off the lever would return to its original position, the valve would close, and the flow of water would stop. It is, mechanically speaking, quite simple. Just a lever, a valve, and gravity. But conceptually, it is remarkable. Hero has created an automated transaction, a machine that exchanges goods for payment without human intervention. He has recognized that a coin has a standard weight and has used that weight as a trigger for a mechanical sequence. He has designed a timed mechanism to prevent customers from getting more water than they paid for. Hero's vending machine was not the only clever device he created. He also designed automatic doors for temples. When a fire was lit on the altar, the heat would cause air in a sealed chamber beneath the altar to expand, pushing water from one container to another through a system of pipes, and the weight of this water would pull ropes that would open the temple doors, apparently by divine power. When the fire went out, the system would reverse and the doors would close. He created a steam-powered device called an aeolipile, a hollow sphere mounted on an axle, with bent tubes extending from it. When water inside the sphere was heated to boiling, steam would jet from the tubes, causing the sphere to spin. This is essentially a steam turbine, demonstrating the principle that would, 17 centuries later, power the Industrial Revolution. Hero understood the principles of hydraulics, pneumatics, gearing, and leverage. He could design complex mechanisms that performed sophisticated tasks. And yet, none of his inventions led to any kind of industrial revolution in the ancient world. The temple doors remained curiosities. The vending machine dispensed holy water, and nothing more. The aeolipile was a toy, a demonstration, not the foundation for steam power. Why not? This is one of the great questions in the history of technology. Hero clearly understood the principles. The Romans had advanced metallurgy, sophisticated engineering, extensive trade networks, and enormous wealth. So why did they not develop these principles into practical technologies that could have transformed their economy? The answer is complex, but it comes down to several factors. First, the ancient world had abundant cheap labor in the form of slavery. There was little economic incentive to develop labor-saving machinery when slaves could do the work. Second, ancient economies were fundamentally different from modern industrial economies. They were based on agriculture and trade, not manufacturing. There was no mass market for manufactured goods, no factory system that could benefit from mechanization. Third, and perhaps most importantly, there was no cultural expectation that technology should improve over time. The ancient world viewed its golden age as being in the past, not the future. The goal was to preserve and transmit knowledge, not necessarily to innovate and improve. They impressed patrons, but there was no broader context that would lead anyone to think, how can we scale this up? How can we apply this principle to transform production? So Hero's inventions remained curiosities, recorded in his treatises, occasionally built by other engineers as demonstrations, but never developed into the transformative technologies they might have become. When the Library of Alexandria burned, when the Roman Empire contracted, when the economic and political structures that supported luxury engineering collapsed, these devices were forgotten. Hero's writings survived, copied and preserved through the Middle Ages, but the devices themselves, the actual working machines, were lost. War has always been a driver of innovation, and the ancient world was no exception. When survival is at stake, when kingdoms rise or fall based on technological advantage, inventors push the boundaries of what is possible. Some of the most remarkable forgotten technologies of antiquity were weapons. Devices so effective, so terrifying, or so far ahead of their time that their very existence seems almost mythological. Let us begin with fire. Not ordinary fire, but a weapon so feared that its very name inspired terror for centuries. Greek fire. It is the year 678 CE, and the Byzantine Empire, the eastern remnant of the Roman Empire, is facing an existential threat. The armies of the Umayyad Caliphate have swept across the Middle East and North Africa with stunning speed, conquering territories that have been Roman for centuries. Now they are besieging Constantinople itself, the great capital of the Byzantine Empire, attacking both by land and by sea. The city's massive walls hold against the land assault, but the Arab fleet threatens to cut off supply lines and starve the city into submission. The Byzantine Emperor, Constantine IV, has a problem that seems insurmountable. The Arab fleet is large, well-commanded, and experienced. Byzantine ships are outnumbered. Conventional naval tactics will not save the city. What Constantine needs is a weapon that can change the fundamental calculus of naval warfare, something that can turn the tide despite the numerical disadvantage. What he gets is Greek fire. The invention is attributed to a Syrian Greek named Kallinikos, a refugee from the Arab conquests who has fled to Constantinople, bringing with him knowledge of a terrifying new weapon. The exact composition remains one of history's great mysteries. The Byzantines guarded the secret so carefully that it died with them. But we know its effects. Greek fire was a liquid incendiary weapon that burned on water, that could not be extinguished by water, that stuck to whatever it touched and continued burning until the fuel was exhausted. The Byzantines deployed Greek fire from specialized ships equipped with bronze tubes, essentially flamethrowers mounted on the prow. When an enemy ship came within range, Byzantine operators would pump the Greek fire mixture through these tubes, where it was ignited, shooting a jet of liquid flame across the water onto the enemy vessel. The effect was devastating, not just physically, but psychologically. Imagine being a sailor on a wooden ship, seeing a stream of fire arcing through the air toward you, hitting your ship and bursting into flames that water cannot quench, that spread across the deck and the sails, that burn everything and everyone they touch. The Arab fleet broke. Ships burned and sank. Survivors spread stories of supernatural fire, of weapons that seemed like sorcery. The siege of Constantinople was lifted, and the Byzantine Empire was saved, at least for the moment. Greek fire would remain a Byzantine secret weapon for centuries, used again and again to defend Constantinople against naval attacks. The formula was a state secret of the highest order, known only to the imperial family and a select few craftsmen who manufactured it. Anyone who revealed the secret faced death. So what was Greek fire? We do not know with certainty, because the Byzantines succeeded in keeping it secret until the formula was eventually lost, probably during the chaos following the Fourth Crusade and the sack of Constantinople in 1204. Modern scholars have proposed various compositions: naphtha, quicklime, sulfur, saltpeter, various resins and oils. Some reconstructions have been made that approximate the described effects, but we cannot be certain we have recreated the original formula. What we do know is that Greek fire represented sophisticated chemical engineering. Its inventors understood combustion, understood how to create mixtures that would burn at high temperatures and resist extinguishing, understood how to make the mixture liquid enough to be pumped through tubes, yet viscous enough to stick to targets. They created what was essentially an ancient napalm, and they did so more than 1,000 years before modern chemistry would rediscover similar principles. Greek fire eventually faded from use, partly because the formula was lost, partly because changes in naval warfare, particularly the development of cannon, made it less strategically relevant. But for centuries, it was the ultimate naval weapon, the technology that kept the Byzantine Empire alive against overwhelming odds. Its loss represents not just the disappearance of a formula, but the loss of an entire tradition of military chemistry. Let us leave Constantinople and travel westward and backward in time, to Syracuse in Sicily, during the Second Punic War. It is 214 BCE, and the Roman Republic is locked in a death struggle with Carthage. Rome has sent a fleet and army to besiege Syracuse, a wealthy Greek city that is allied with Carthage. The Roman commander, Marcus Claudius Marcellus, expects a relatively straightforward siege. Syracuse is rich, but not particularly martial, and Roman legions have never been defeated in a set-piece battle. What Marcellus does not anticipate is Archimedes. Archimedes of Syracuse is perhaps the greatest mathematician and engineer of the ancient world. He has discovered fundamental principles of geometry, physics, and hydrostatics. He has invented the Archimedes screw, a device for raising water that is still used today in some parts of the world. He has calculated pi with remarkable accuracy. He has laid the foundations for calculus 2,000 years before Newton and Leibniz. But when his city is threatened, Archimedes turns his genius to weapons. According to historical accounts, some more reliable than others, Archimedes designed a series of defensive weapons that turned Syracuse into an impregnable fortress. There were massive cranes positioned along the walls that could swing out over attacking ships, drop heavy weights to smash them, or use grappling hooks to lift the ships partly out of the water and then drop them, swamping them, or breaking their hulls. There were catapults of unprecedented range and accuracy, able to strike Roman ships while they were still far from shore. These catapults used sophisticated mechanical principles. Archimedes understood leverage, understood tension and torsion, understood how to calculate trajectories. His war machines could adjust their angle and tension to hit targets at different distances with consistent accuracy. And then there are the burning mirrors, the most controversial of Archimedes' weapons. According to some accounts, Archimedes designed large bronze mirrors, or perhaps arrays of smaller shields held by soldiers that could focus sunlight onto Roman ships, heating them until they caught fire. This story has been debated for centuries. Some modern experiments have suggested it is possible under ideal conditions. Others argue that the story is apocryphal, that setting a ship on fire at distance using reflected sunlight is impractical given the movement of ships, the imperfect nature of ancient mirrors, and the time it would take to heat wood to combustion. Whether or not the burning mirrors worked as described, the other weapons certainly did. The Roman siege of Syracuse, expected to last weeks, dragged on for 2 years. Roman soldiers developed what we might call post-traumatic stress from Archimedes' weapons. They would panic at the sight of a rope or wooden beam appearing above the city walls, fearing another of the inventor's deadly devices. Marcellus, frustrated and impressed, reportedly said that Archimedes was using his ships to ladle water from the sea, and that against such a geometrician, the hundred-handed ones of mythology would not stand a chance. Syracuse eventually fell, not through assault, but through betrayal. Someone opened a gate, and Roman soldiers poured in during a festival when the defenders were drunk and distracted. Marcellus had given orders that Archimedes was to be captured alive. He wanted the great inventor for Rome. But in the chaos of the sack, a Roman soldier found an old man drawing geometric figures in the sand, ordered him to come along, and when the old man refused, "Do not disturb my circles," he allegedly said. The soldier killed him. With Archimedes died much of his engineering knowledge. We have some of his mathematical treatises, preserved through Arabic translations and Byzantine copies. But his engineering works, his mechanical designs, the precise details of his war machines, these were lost. Later engineers tried to reconstruct them based on descriptions, but without the original plans, without Archimedes' understanding of the principles involved, the reconstructions were inferior. Archimedes represents a particular tragedy in the history of lost technology. He was a theoretical genius who also understood practical application. He could both discover fundamental principles and design machines that implemented those principles. How many other weapons, how many other tools and devices did he design that were never recorded? How much further ahead might engineering have advanced if his workshop had survived, if his students had preserved his methods, if the Romans had valued his practical knowledge as much as they valued his city's gold? Let us move now from the weapons of defense to the tools of healing, for ancient medicine also possessed knowledge and instruments that would be lost and later rediscovered. It is the 2nd century CE, and a young man lies on a surgical table in Rome. He has suffered a severe injury to his leg in a construction accident. A falling timber has crushed the bone and torn the flesh. In any other era before modern medicine, his fate would be amputation at best, death from infection at worst. But his family has wealth, and they have secured the services of one of Rome's finest physicians. The physician examining him is skilled in a tradition of medicine that goes back centuries, to the Greek physician Hippocrates and beyond. He has studied anatomy through dissection, not of human bodies, which is generally forbidden, but of animals, particularly pigs, whose anatomy is remarkably similar to humans. He has read the works of earlier physicians. He has served as a physician to gladiators, where he has gained practical experience treating traumatic injuries of every type imaginable. The physician examines the wound carefully. The bone is shattered, but not completely destroyed. If he can realign the fragments, if he can hold them in place while they heal, if he can prevent infection, the young man might keep his leg. He calls for his instruments. The medical kit of a Roman surgeon in the 2nd century CE is remarkably sophisticated. There are bronze scalpels of various sizes and shapes, some with fixed blades, others with removable blades that can be changed depending on the procedure. There are forceps, tweezers, probes, hooks, and retractors, instruments for holding open incisions, for grasping tissues, for exploring wounds. There are bone drills, slender bronze or iron instruments that can be spun between the palms to drill into bone, used for relieving pressure from skull fractures or for anchoring surgical wires. There are bone saws with fine teeth for cutting through bone when necessary. There are needles and surgical thread for closing incisions, typically using linen thread or animal gut, techniques that remained essentially unchanged until the modern era. But perhaps most remarkably, there are specialized instruments that demonstrate surprising anatomical knowledge and surgical sophistication. There are specula, devices for dilating and holding open body cavities during examination or surgery. A vaginal speculum from Pompeii, preserved in the volcanic ash, uses a screw mechanism to open bronze blades, allowing a physician to examine the cervix. The design is so effective that modern specula work on essentially the same principle. There are catheters for draining the bladder, made of bronze or leather. There are instruments for cataract surgery. The Romans could perform a procedure called couching, where a needle was used to push a clouded lens out of the line of sight, partially restoring vision. There are instruments for removing arrowheads and spear points, including specialized extractors with retractable hooks designed to pull barbed projectiles out of flesh without causing additional damage. The physician treating our injured patient uses his skills and his instruments to perform a procedure that would not be out of place in a modern emergency room, minus the anesthesia and antibiotics. He cleans the wound thoroughly, using wine or vinegar as an antiseptic. He realigns the bone fragments as precisely as he can, feeling with his fingers and probes to ensure proper positioning. He binds the leg in splints to immobilize it. He closes the torn flesh with sutures. He applies bandages soaked in wine and medicinal preparations, mixtures of herbs and minerals that, whatever their actual pharmaceutical effect, at least keep the wound clean. Will the patient survive? Perhaps. Roman medicine could not prevent infection, could not treat shock, could not address internal injuries or complications, but it could set bones, close wounds, remove foreign objects, and give the body a chance to heal itself. Many patients survived procedures that would seem impossibly risky by modern standards. And yet, much of this medical knowledge was lost. The Roman tradition of medicine declined along with the empire itself. The great medical schools closed, libraries burned, the social structures that supported professional medicine collapsed. In the chaos that followed, much practical medical knowledge disappeared. Medieval European medicine, for several centuries, was actually less sophisticated than Roman medicine had been, relying more on tradition and superstition than on the empirical, practical approach that Roman physicians had developed. Many Roman surgical instruments disappeared from use and had to be reinvented centuries later. The vaginal speculum was invented in the 19th century. The physicians who created it had no idea that they were recreating a Roman design. Techniques for cataract surgery were rediscovered independently in the 18th century. Even basic principles of surgical hygiene, cleaning wounds, using clean instruments, were forgotten and had to be relearned in the 19th century after decades of unnecessary deaths from surgical infections. Why was this knowledge lost? Partly because medicine depends on a literate tradition, on texts that must be preserved, copied, and studied. When that tradition broke down, when Latin became less widely known, when libraries were destroyed or neglected, the texts disappeared. Partly because medicine depends on stable institutions, schools where physicians are trained, hospitals where they can practice, professional organizations that maintain standards. When those institutions collapsed, the profession itself declined. But the loss also reflects something about how knowledge is valued. Roman surgical instruments were practical tools used by working physicians, not particularly beautiful or made from precious materials. When physicians died, their instruments were melted down for the bronze or discarded as scrap. No one thought to preserve them as artifacts. No one imagined that future generations would need to rediscover the knowledge they represented, and with them, the techniques and skills that had taken centuries to develop. The knowledge survived in fragments, in incomplete texts, in garbled translations, but the practical tradition, the actual ability to perform these procedures, was lost and had to be painfully rebuilt over many centuries. Sometimes, the most remarkable ancient technologies were not machines or weapons, but materials, substances with properties so unusual, so valuable, that they seemed almost magical. The ancient world developed sophisticated metallurgy, created alloys and ceramics with remarkable properties, and occasionally stumbled upon materials whose composition remained mysterious for centuries or was lost entirely. Let us begin with a material that, according to Roman historians, should not have been possible: flexible glass. It is sometime during the reign of the Emperor Tiberius, in the 1st century CE, an inventor, his name is not recorded in the surviving accounts, seeks an audience with the emperor. He brings with him a remarkable demonstration, a drinking vessel made of glass. This alone is not particularly impressive. Glass making is well established by this period, and glass vessels are common, though expensive. But what happens next is extraordinary. The inventor takes the glass vessel and throws it on the floor. The vessel does not shatter. Instead, it dents, like a metal cup would dent. The inventor then takes a small hammer from his bag and taps the dent, and the glass pops back into its original shape, completely undamaged. He has created flexible, malleable glass, vitrum flexile in Latin, glass that behaves like metal, that can be bent without breaking, that can be repaired with simple tools. The emperor examines the vessel carefully. If such glass could be produced in quantity, it would revolutionize the glass industry. It would be far more valuable than ordinary glass, more practical than metal, potentially as valuable as precious metals. The emperor asks the inventor the crucial question: Does anyone else know how to make this material? The inventor proudly responds that no, he alone possesses the secret. The formula is his exclusive discovery. At which point, according to the Roman historians Pliny the Elder and Petronius, the emperor has the inventor beheaded and orders the inventor's workshop destroyed. Why? Because flexible glass, if it could be produced in quantity, would devalue the emperor's gold and silver. If glass could serve all the functions of precious metals while being essentially unlimited in quantity, sand is everywhere, then the economic basis of imperial wealth would collapse. Is this story true? We cannot be certain. Roman historians sometimes included tales that were more moral fables than factual accounts, and this story has all the hallmarks of a cautionary tale about the dangers of innovation that threatens established power. But multiple ancient sources mention flexible glass, suggesting that something of the sort did exist, even if the story of its suppression is exaggerated. Modern materials scientists have speculated about what flexible glass might have been. Perhaps it was not true glass, silicon dioxide, but some kind of polymer, some organic material that resembled glass but had very different properties. Perhaps it was glass treated or alloyed with something that gave it unusual flexibility. Some experiments have been conducted with glass that contains certain additives that make it somewhat less brittle, though nothing approaches the flexibility described in the ancient accounts. Whatever flexible glass actually was, the knowledge of how to make it was lost. If the emperor's suppression was real, it succeeded completely. If the inventor died without sharing his secret, that secret died with him. Either way, humanity lost a material that might have changed the course of history, a substance that combined the clarity and chemical resistance of glass with the durability and flexibility of metal. Let us turn now from a material that was lost to a material whose composition remains one of the great mysteries of ancient technology, Damascus steel. It is the time of the Crusades, and European knights are encountering Islamic warriors equipped with swords of extraordinary quality. These swords, primarily manufactured in Damascus, hence the name, possess properties that seem almost supernatural. They are incredibly sharp, able to slice through European swords or armor. They are flexible, ending without breaking. They maintain their edge even after extensive use, and they are beautiful, their blades marked with distinctive watery patterns, swirling designs that seem to flow across the steel's surface. The Crusaders are accustomed to their own weapons, forged from European steel, according to techniques that have been refined over centuries. But Damascus steel is simply superior. European swordsmiths cannot duplicate it. They can see the watery patterns on the blade, they can test its properties, they can admire its craftsmanship, but they cannot understand how it is made. What is Damascus steel? The name refers to the city where these blades were often sold and sometimes finished, but the actual steel came from further east, from India, where it was called wood steel. Indian smiths had developed a technique for producing steel ingots with very high carbon content, around 1.5% carbon, while keeping the steel homogeneous and free of large slag inclusions that would weaken it. These ingots were exported to the Middle East, where bladesmiths would forge them into swords, knives, and other weapons. The forging process was crucial. The smith had to heat the steel to just the right temperature, work it carefully to develop the crystalline structure that produced both the distinctive pattern and the remarkable properties, then quench and temper it precisely. The watery patterns visible on the blade were not decoration, but evidence of the steel's internal structure, bands of iron carbide nanotubes and carbon nanowires, though of course ancient smiths had no knowledge of these microscopic structures. They simply knew that when they followed certain procedures, they produced steel with certain desirable properties. Damascus steel swords were treasured throughout the Islamic world and beyond. They were gifts fit for kings, weapons that could turn the tide of battle, objects of wonder that inspired legends. Stories told of Damascus blades that could cut through rifle barrels, though such tales were likely exaggerated. But the swords were genuinely superior to anything Europeans could produce at the time, and they remained so for centuries. And then, sometime around 1750, the knowledge of how to make Damascus steel disappeared. The last known Damascus steel swords were forged in the mid-18th century. After that, the techniques were lost. What happened? We are not entirely certain, but several factors probably contributed. The supply of wood steel from India declined. Perhaps the ore sources were exhausted. Perhaps the political upheavals in India disrupted production. Perhaps the knowledge of making Wootz steel itself was lost. Without proper Wootz ingots, Middle Eastern smiths could not produce Damascus steel blades. Additionally, the smiths who knew the forging techniques died without adequately training successors. The knowledge was probably closely guarded, passed from master to apprentice within families or guilds. When those transmission chains broke, through death, economic disruption, or the simple fact that fewer people wanted to become swordsmiths as firearms became dominant, the knowledge vanished. For over 200 years, Damascus steel remained a mystery. Metallurgists examined surviving blades, analyzed their composition, studied their structure under microscopes. They could describe what Damascus steel was. They could identify the carbon content, the crystalline structures, the patterns of carbides, but they could not reliably reproduce it. Various bladesmiths claimed to have rediscovered the secret, but their products never quite matched the originals. Only in recent decades, using modern metallurgy and our understanding of material science at the nanoscale, have researchers begun to produce steel with properties similar to historical Damascus steel. We now understand that the key lies in the precise carbon content, the presence of certain trace elements like vanadium in the original Indian ore, and the careful control of temperature during forging. But even with this understanding, replicating Damascus steel remains difficult. The original smiths, working without thermometers or microscopes, relying only on experience and transmitted knowledge, produced something that modern science has struggled to match. Let us move now from steel to stone, and from the Middle East to Rome, and consider a material so important to Roman civilization that its loss represents one of the great tragedies of forgotten technology: Roman concrete. It is 126 CE, and the Emperor Hadrian is dedicating the Pantheon in Rome, perhaps the most remarkable building of the ancient world. The Pantheon is a temple to all the gods, and its design is revolutionary. The main chamber is circular, topped by a dome that spans 142 feet, a dome larger than any that will be built for more than 1,000 years, larger even than the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, which will be constructed 14 centuries later. The dome is made of concrete, not modern Portland cement concrete, but Roman concrete, a material with properties that in some ways surpass modern concrete. The Romans have been using concrete for construction for over 2 centuries by this point. They have perfected techniques for building massive structures, aqueducts, harbors, amphitheaters, baths, using a material that is relatively cheap, can be shaped into almost any form, and becomes as hard as stone. Roman concrete consists of a mixture of lime mortar, volcanic ash called pozzolana, and aggregate, chunks of stone, brick, or other materials. The key ingredient is the pozzolana, which reacts with the lime to create a hydraulic cement, a cement that sets and hardens even underwater. This property allows Romans to build harbor installations, bridge foundations, and other structures that must withstand constant water exposure. But Roman concrete has another property that modern scientists have only recently understood. It gets stronger over time. Modern concrete made with Portland cement gradually deteriorates, especially when exposed to seawater. Roman concrete structures, by contrast, have stood for 2,000 years and show little sign of degradation. Harbor installations built by the Romans remain solid and intact. The Pantheon's dome, unreinforced by any internal structure, continues to stand as solidly as the day it was completed. How is this possible? Modern analysis has revealed that Roman concrete undergoes a chemical process when exposed to seawater. The interaction between the lime, the volcanic ash, and the minerals in seawater actually creates new crystalline structures within the concrete that strengthen it. The concrete, in effect, heals itself, filling microscopic cracks and becoming denser and more durable over time. The Romans did not understand the chemistry involved. They simply knew from experience that their concrete worked extraordinarily well in marine environments. The Romans used concrete on an astonishing scale. The Pantheon's dome alone required thousands of tons of concrete, carefully poured in layers, with the aggregate getting lighter toward the top, heavy stone at the base, lighter brick and pumice higher up, reducing the weight and stress on the structure. Harbor installations like those at Caesarea incorporated massive concrete blocks weighing hundreds of tons, poured underwater using wooden forms. And then this knowledge was lost. When the Roman Empire collapsed, when the economic and political structures that supported large-scale construction disappeared, when the expertise of Roman engineers was no longer passed down through apprenticeship and practice, the techniques for making and using Roman concrete vanished. Medieval builders did not know how to make hydraulic cement. They used lime mortar, which served well enough for most purposes, but lacked the durability and versatility of Roman concrete. The formula for Roman concrete was not exactly a secret. Vitruvius, a Roman architect, wrote about it in his treatise on architecture. But knowing the ingredients is not the same as knowing the techniques. How exactly should the materials be mixed? In what proportions? How should the concrete be poured and cured? What kinds of aggregate work best for different applications? These practical details, learned through experience and transmitted through practice, were lost. It was not until the 18th century that hydraulic cements began to be redeveloped in Europe, and not until the 19th century that Portland cement, the basis of modern concrete, was invented. Modern concrete is in many ways more versatile than Roman concrete, easier to work with, faster setting, but in terms of longevity, especially in marine environments, Roman concrete remains superior. We are only now in the 21st century beginning to understand why, and starting to incorporate some Roman techniques into modern concrete formulations. The loss of Roman concrete had profound consequences. Medieval and Renaissance engineers, lacking concrete, had to build in stone, which limited what they could construct. The great Roman vaults and domes could not be replicated. Harbour works deteriorated and could not be maintained. The scale and ambition of Roman engineering was not matched again until the modern era, and part of the reason was simply that later civilizations lacked the materials that had made Roman achievements possible.
The ancient world was connected by trade routes that spanned continents and crossed oceans. Merchants traveled from Rome to India, from China to the Mediterranean, carrying silk and spices, gold and glassware, exchanging goods and ideas across vast distances. But travel in the ancient world was dangerous and uncertain. Without accurate maps, without compasses, without the ability to determine position precisely, sailors navigated by landmarks, by the stars, by experience and luck. And yet some ancient civilizations developed navigation technologies of surprising sophistication, technologies that were later lost and had to be reinvented. Let us begin in China, during the Han Dynasty, with a device that demonstrates an understanding of magnetism centuries before it would be rediscovered in the West, the south-pointing chariot. It is sometime in the 3rd century CE, and an emperor is reviewing a demonstration of a remarkable vehicle. It is a chariot, elaborately decorated, with a wooden figure of a sage mounted on top. The sage's arm is extended, pointing forward. The chariot is positioned facing south, and as it moves, turning corners, following winding paths, the figure on top continues to point south, its arm always indicating the same direction, regardless of how the chariot turns. This is the south-pointing chariot, or Sinan Che in Chinese. Despite its name and its function, it is not a magnetic compass. The figure does not point south because of magnetism, but because of an ingenious mechanical system inside the chariot. The device uses differential gearing, a system where two wheels can turn at different rates, and their relative motion is translated through gears to rotate the figure on top in the opposite direction of the chariot's turn, keeping it always pointing in the same direction. Think about the sophistication this requires. The inventor had to understand that when a vehicle turns, its two wheels travel different distances. The outer wheel travels farther than the inner wheel. They had to design a gear system that could detect this difference and use it to calculate the angle of the turn. They had to build gears precise enough that the system would work reliably over many turns, that accumulated errors would not throw off the pointing direction. The south-pointing chariot was not primarily a practical navigation device. It was too large, too complex, too expensive for everyday use. It was a demonstration of imperial power and Chinese technical sophistication, a ceremonial object that showed that Chinese engineers could create mechanisms of extraordinary cleverness. But it also demonstrated genuine understanding of mechanical principles and precise manufacturing capabilities. The device was described in historical texts, and several Chinese inventors claim to have built working versions over the centuries. But no original survives, and the exact mechanism was lost and had to be reconstructed multiple times. Modern engineers have built working replicas based on the descriptions, proving that the basic principle is sound. But the original devices, with whatever refinements their creators incorporated, are gone. What the south-pointing chariot shows us is that ancient Chinese engineers understood differential gearing, the same principle used in modern automobile differentials,
more than 1,000 years before it appeared in European technology. This knowledge existed, was applied, was recorded in texts, and yet somehow failed to propagate widely or to lead to other applications. The south-pointing chariot remained a curiosity, occasionally rebuilt by clever engineers, but never developed into a broader tradition of gear-based mechanical engineering. Let us move now from China to the Polynesian islands of the Pacific, and consider a navigation technology of a completely different kind. One based not on mechanical devices, but on human knowledge, transmitted orally, embodied in objects that modern scholars struggled to understand for decades. It is sometime in the 15th century, though the traditions are far older, and a Polynesian navigator is preparing for a voyage across hundreds of miles of open ocean. He is sailing from one island to another that he has never personally seen, that lies beyond the horizon, that can only be reached by sailing for days across featureless water. He has no compass, no sextant, no charts in the modern sense, and yet he is confident he will find his destination. His tools are knowledge and observation. He knows the stars, not just their names and positions, but their rising and setting points, how they move across the sky through the night and through the seasons. He can navigate by star positions, keeping certain stars at certain angles to his vessel, adjusting his course as different stars rise and set through the night. He knows the ocean itself, the patterns of swells that radiate from distant islands, the way currents flow, the colors of water at different depths. He knows that certain species of birds fly out from land to fish during the day and return at evening, and by observing these birds' flight paths, he can determine the direction of land even when it is far beyond the horizon. He knows that clouds behave differently over islands than over open ocean. They pile up over land, reflecting the color of lagoons, creating patterns visible from great distances. And he has a tool, a stick chart. These charts, unique to Pacific Islander navigation, are frameworks of coconut palm ribs, lashed together with coconut fiber, with shells attached at various points. The sticks represent ocean swells, their directions, how they interact, how they are refracted by islands. The shells represent islands. To a Western observer, these charts look almost abstract, like primitive art. But to a trained navigator, they are precise representations of ocean conditions, encoding information about wave patterns that allow a skilled sailor to determine position and direction, even in the middle of the ocean. Polynesian navigation was one of the great achievements of ancient technology. Using only human observation and orally transmitted knowledge, Polynesian navigators explored and settled islands across millions of square miles of ocean. They made deliberate voyages of exploration, not just accidental drifts with currents. They could sail to destinations and return. They could pass down knowledge of routes and destinations across generations. Their achievements rival anything accomplished by European explorers with all their instruments and charts. And yet, this knowledge was nearly lost. With European colonization, with the introduction of Western navigation technology, with the disruption of traditional cultures, the old navigation traditions faded. Fewer young people learned the skills. The knowledge resided in the minds of elderly navigators, and when they died, much of their knowledge died with them. By the mid-20th century, traditional Polynesian navigation was nearly extinct. It was only in the 1970s that a deliberate effort was made to preserve and revive these traditions. The Polynesian Voyaging Society built a replica of a traditional voyaging canoe, the Hokulea, and found one of the last traditional navigators, Malpiailug from the Caroline Islands, willing to teach the old methods. In 1976, Hokulea sailed from Hawaii to Tahiti using only traditional navigation. No instruments, no charts, just the skills that ancient navigators had used, proving that the old methods worked, that the knowledge was genuine and not mythical. Since then, there has been a renaissance of traditional navigation in the Pacific, with new generations learning the old skills. But the fact remains that this knowledge came perilously close to extinction. If the revival effort had come a generation later, the knowledge might have been lost entirely, taking with it an entire way of understanding and interacting with the ocean. Let us return now to the Mediterranean world and to the problem of time. Measuring time accurately was crucial for ancient civilizations. Religious rituals had to be performed at the correct times. Market days and legal proceedings needed to be scheduled. The hours of daylight needed to be divided for work and rest. and yet accurate timekeeping was surprisingly difficult. The simplest time-measuring devices were sundials, a stake in the ground casting a shadow that moves as the sun moves across the sky. Sundials work well enough on sunny days, but they are useless at night or in cloudy weather. And they require different calibrations at different latitudes. Water clocks, vessels that leak water at a steady rate, with markings to show how much time has passed, worked regardless of weather or time of day, but they were difficult to calibrate accurately, and their rate varied with temperature, water pressure, and the size of the leak hole. Ancient inventors developed increasingly sophisticated time-measuring devices, but one of the most elaborate was created by the same engineer we met earlier, Hero of Alexandria. Among his many inventions was an automated theater, a device that used a falling weight to drive a complex series of mechanical actions, creating a miniature play, complete with moving figures, changing scenes, and coordinated sound effects. The device worked like this. Typically, a container filled with grain or sand would slowly descend, pulled by gravity. As it descended, it turned a drum wrapped with a rope. The rotation of this drum, through a series of gears and cams, drove various mechanisms. Figures would move across a stage. Doors would open and close. Thunder effects would sound. Scene backgrounds would change. All of this was choreographed to tell a story, typically a brief mythological scene, with the falling weight providing steady, regulated power. What makes this relevant to timekeeping is that Hero had developed a reliable method for regulating the fall of the weight. The grain or sand flowed out of the container through a small hole at a consistent rate, and this rate could be adjusted by changing the size of the hole or the type of material used. This gave Hero a power source that could drive mechanisms for precise, predictable durations, essentially, a mechanical timer. The automated theater itself was a luxury item, a curiosity for wealthy patrons, but the principle, using a falling weight regulated by the outflow of granular material to power mechanisms, represented sophisticated understanding of mechanical timing. With refinement, such systems could have developed into accurate clocks, centuries before mechanical clocks were actually invented in medieval Europe, but they did not. Hero's automated theaters remained novelties. The principle of weight-driven mechanisms was not applied to practical timekeeping. When mechanical clocks were eventually developed in medieval European monasteries, they used different principles, verge and foliot escapements, later pendulums, apparently without any awareness of Hero's weight-driven mechanisms. Why was Hero's approach not developed further? Partly because ancient societies did not have the same need for precise timekeeping that medieval monasteries did. Religious rituals in monasteries needed to be performed at exact hours throughout the night, creating pressure to develop reliable clocks. Ancient temples had less demanding requirements, partly because Hero's mechanisms, while clever, required considerable maintenance and adjustment. The flow rate of grain or sand changes with humidity, packing, temperature. The mechanisms needed frequent cleaning and repair. But mostly, it seems, because there was no institutional pressure to improve timekeeping technology. Ancient societies managed with sundials and water clocks. They divided the day into 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of night, with the length of an hour varying by season. A system that worked well enough for practical purposes, even if it lacked precision. There was no compelling reason to invest in developing better clocks, so the technology remained undeveloped. And Hero's weight-driven timing mechanisms remained curiosities rather than becoming the foundation for a tradition of mechanical timekeeping. Ancient builders achieved feats of construction that continue to astound us today. They moved stones weighing hundreds of tons, built structures that have stood for millennia, created buildings of such scale and precision that we struggle to understand how they were accomplished with ancient tools and methods. Some of these construction techniques were recorded and transmitted. Others were lost, leaving us with magnificent ruins and profound mysteries about how they were created. Let us begin with a technology so fundamental to Greek architecture that its loss seems almost incomprehensible: the art of curved entasis in stone columns. Stand before a Greek temple, the Parthenon in Athens, the Temple of Hera at Paestum, any of the great Doric temples built during the classical period, and look closely at the columns. They appear at first glance to be perfectly straight cylinders, tapering slightly toward the top. But look more carefully, measure precisely, and you will discover something remarkable. The columns are not straight. They curve outward very slightly in the middle,
swelling imperceptibly before tapering at the top. This curve is called entasis. Why would Greek architects deliberately make their columns curve? The answer lies in optical illusion. A perfectly straight column, when viewed from a distance, appears to curve inward slightly. The eye plays tricks, making straight vertical lines seem to bow inward at the middle. The Greeks discovered that by building a slight outward curve into the column, they could compensate for this optical illusion, making the column appear perfectly straight to the human eye. But entasis is not just a simple curve, it is a parabolic curve, mathematically calculated, different for columns of different heights and proportions. And it had to be carved into solid stone. The Greek builders who created these columns had to understand the geometry, had to calculate the precise curve, and then had to execute it in stone with extraordinary precision. The columns of the Parthenon are carved from marble so precisely that in some places the joints between stones are less than a millimeter wide, so tight that you cannot slide a knife blade between them. How did they do this? We know they used bronze tools, chisels, hammers, drills. We know they used measuring devices, straight edges, plumb lines, calipers, but the actual techniques for calculating and carving entasis were never written down in detail. They were craft knowledge, transmitted from master mason to apprentice, learned through years of practice and observation. When Greek civilization declined, when the great building projects ceased, when the tradition of monumental stone construction faded, this knowledge was lost. Roman builders continued to use columns, but Roman columns generally lack the subtle entasis of Greek work. Roman construction was often cruder, more concerned with grandeur of scale than with refinement of proportion and optical effects. Medieval builders, when they rediscovered classical architecture during the Renaissance, had to relearn these principles. They studied Greek ruins, measured columns, tried to understand the proportions and curves. But they were essentially reverse engineering a lost technology, trying to reconstruct techniques from finished products without access to the original methods. Even today, with all our measuring tools and mathematical understanding, creating stone columns with properly calculated entasis requires considerable skill and knowledge. The loss of entasis technique represents a larger pattern, the loss of aesthetic knowledge, of understanding about how humans perceive form and proportion. The Greeks had developed, through experimentation and refinement over centuries, an understanding of optical effects and how to compensate for them. This knowledge was embodied in practice, in the trained eyes and hands of master craftsmen, and when the practice ended, the knowledge vanished. Let us move now from Greece to China and consider a construction technology that was not lost, but rather remained unknown to the West for centuries: earthquake-resistant architecture. It is the year 1056 CE, and construction is being completed on the Sakyamuni Pagoda in Shanxi Province, China. The pagoda stands over 200 feet tall, built entirely of wood, interlocking wooden components held together without nails, using only mortise and tenon joints, brackets, and the weight of the structure itself. The pagoda has 9 stories on the exterior, though the interior contains additional hidden floors for structural support. The region where the pagoda stands is seismically active. Major earthquakes have struck this area multiple times throughout history, toppling buildings, killing thousands. And yet the builders construct this tall wooden tower, and they do so with confidence that it will survive. They have reason for this confidence. Chinese architects have developed over many centuries a system of construction that is remarkably resistant to earthquake damage. The key lies in the flexibility of the structure. Unlike stone buildings, which are rigid and can crack or collapse when shaken, Chinese wooden buildings are designed to flex and sway. The joints between wooden members allow movement. The brackets that support the roof can shift and settle. The entire structure can absorb seismic energy through controlled deformation, bending without breaking. The Sakyamuni Pagoda has survived more than 40 significant earthquakes in the nearly 1,000 years since its construction. It has swayed, it has creaked. Wooden components have shifted and settled, but it has not fallen. Modern engineers studying the structure have marveled at its sophisticated design, the way the hidden interior floors provide additional bracing, the way the interlocking components distribute stress, the way the building's proportions and construction methods make it inherently stable, yet flexible. This technology, called it flexible frame construction, was highly developed in China,
Japan, and other parts of East Asia, but it remained essentially unknown in the West until the modern era. Western architecture was based on stone and brick, on creating rigid structures that would resist forces through mass and strength. The idea of building structures designed to flex and absorb energy was foreign to Western architectural tradition. When Western architects finally began to understand earthquake-resistant design in the 20th century, when engineers developed systems of base isolation and flexible framing for modern buildings, they were essentially rediscovering principles that Chinese builders had understood for over 1,000 years. The specific techniques differ. Modern buildings use steel frames and special damping systems, not wooden brackets, but the fundamental principle is the same. Flexibility can be stronger than rigidity when dealing with seismic forces. Why did this knowledge not spread from China to the West earlier? Partly because architectural knowledge is highly contextual. Western builders, working in regions with different seismic activity, different available materials, and different aesthetic traditions, had no reason to adopt Chinese methods. Partly because architectural techniques are difficult to transmit without actual demonstration. You need to see and touch and work with a flexible wooden structure to truly understand how it functions. Written descriptions, even detailed ones, cannot convey the embodied knowledge that comes from building and maintaining such structures. Let us consider one more lost architectural technique, this one for Rome, a technology so valuable that its rediscovery in the Renaissance changed the course of architectural history. The dome on pendentives. It is 537 CE, and the Emperor Justinian is dedicating the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, the greatest church in Christendom. The building is enormous. Its central dome spans over 100 feet and rises nearly 200 feet above the floor. But what makes it truly revolutionary is not just its size, but how it is constructed. A dome is relatively simple to build if you are covering a circular structure. You simply raise the dome from the circular walls. But the Hagia Sophia is not circular. Its main space is rectangular, and the dome sits above this rectangular space, seeming to float impossibly, supported at only 4 points by massive pillars at the corners. The trick is the use of pendentives, curved triangular sections that transition from the square base to the circular dome. Each pendentive is essentially a section of a larger dome, curved in 2 directions, transferring the weight of the dome above down to the pillars below. The mathematics and engineering required to design and construct pendentives are sophisticated. The curves must be calculated precisely. The forces must be understood and managed. The construction must be executed with great skill. The Hagia Sophia's dome famously collapsed during an earthquake, just 20 years after construction, but it was rebuilt, and the rebuilt dome has stood for nearly 1,500 years. And it allowed Byzantine architects to create soaring interior spaces, unlike anything built before. And yet, this technology was lost to Western Europe. When the Roman Empire split, when Constantinople became isolated from the West, when the architectural traditions diverged, Western builders forgot or never learned how to construct domes on pendentives. Medieval European churches used different systems, barrel vaults, groin vaults, wooden roofs. They could not create the kind of vast, open, dome spaces that Byzantine architects had mastered. It was not until the Renaissance, when architects like Brunelleschi studied Roman and Byzantine ruins, that the technique was rediscovered in the West. Brunelleschi's dome for Florence Cathedral, completed in 1436, represents the relearning of principles that had been understood 1,000 years earlier. His achievement was remarkable, but it was essentially a rediscovery, a recovery of lost knowledge, rather than a completely new invention. Why was this knowledge lost? The usual reasons: political fragmentation, economic decline, the breakdown of the institutions that supported large-scale construction projects. Building a dome on pendentives requires not just theoretical knowledge, but practical experience. It requires master masons who have built such structures before, who understand the stresses involved, who know how to construct the wooden forms that support the dome during construction, who can train the next generation of builders. When the great building projects stopped, when wealthy patrons disappeared, when the master masons died without passing on their knowledge, the tradition ended. Books might preserve some information, descriptions of buildings, perhaps some geometric principles, but books cannot convey the tacit knowledge, the practical wisdom, the skilled judgment that comes only from actually building these structures. The loss of pendentive construction technology meant that Western Europe, for nearly 1,000 years, could not build the kinds of monumental interior spaces that had been possible in the late Roman and Byzantine periods. Architectural ambition was constrained by architectural capability. It was only when the knowledge was laboriously recovered, when Renaissance architects studied ruins and experimented with construction techniques, that Western architecture could again achieve what had been accomplished centuries before. We have journeyed through workshops and battlefields, through construction sites and laboratories, examining technologies that were created, used, and lost. Now, as we conclude our exploration, let us step back and consider the patterns that emerge from these stories, the reasons why knowledge disappears, and the conditions under which it can be recovered. The first and most obvious pattern is that knowledge is fragile. We tend to think of technology as progressive, as inevitably advancing, building on what came before. But the history we have examined shows that this is not always true. Technologies can be lost, sometimes completely, sometimes for centuries. The Antikythera mechanism, Greek fire, Damascus steel, Roman concrete, each represents sophisticated knowledge that disappeared, leaving later generations to struggle with problems that had already been solved. Why is knowledge so fragile? Part of the answer lies in how technical knowledge is transmitted. We imagine that if something is written down, it is preserved. But most technical knowledge is not primarily in books. It is in the hands and eyes of skilled craftsmen, in the practiced judgment of experienced engineers, in the tacit understanding that comes from years of working with materials and tools. Consider Damascus steel. We have descriptions of Damascus blades, analyses of their composition, even surviving examples that can be studied. But for 2 centuries, no one could reliably reproduce them, because the crucial knowledge was not in the composition, but in the process, the exact temperatures, the specific forging techniques, the subtle judgments about when the steel was ready for the next step. This knowledge lived in the muscles and intuitions of master smiths, and when they died without adequately training successors, the knowledge died with them. This is what scholars call tacit knowledge, knowledge that cannot be fully articulated or written down, that can only be learned through practice and apprenticeship. Much of ancient technology depended on tacit knowledge, and tacit knowledge is extremely vulnerable to disruption. If the chain of transmission breaks, if students do not learn from masters, if workshops close, if the economic conditions that support specialized crafts disappear, then the knowledge is lost, often irretrievably. A second pattern is that technology depends on context. A technology is not just a tool or a technique. It is embedded in a network of supporting institutions, economic structures, and social practices. Roman concrete was not just a recipe. It required quarries producing the right kind of volcanic ash, lime kilns operating at scale, construction projects large enough to justify developing expertise, and most crucially, a building tradition that passed knowledge from generation to generation. The technology became unusable, even if the recipe was still known. This explains why simply having ancient texts is not enough to recover lost technologies. Vitruvius described Roman concrete, but medieval builders could not simply read his text and start building like Romans. They lacked the context, the quarries, the kilns, the building tradition, the accumulated experience of what worked and what did not. Knowledge without context is like a seed without soil. It cannot grow into actual capability. A third pattern involves the question of why technologies are lost. Sometimes the answer is catastrophic: wars, invasions, plagues, economic collapse. The fall of the Roman Empire destroyed the economic and political structures that supported Roman technology. The sack of Baghdad by the Mongols in 1258 destroyed one of the great centers of Islamic learning, including countless texts on science and engineering. These dramatic collapses clearly explain some losses. But sometimes technologies are lost even without catastrophe. Greek fire was lost, despite Byzantium's continuity as a state. Damascus steel production ended, not because of conquest, but apparently because of the exhaustion of ore supplies and the disruption of trade networks. Flexible glass, if it ever existed, was lost possibly because it was deliberately suppressed, or possibly just because one inventor died without sharing his secret. Technologies can be lost simply through neglect. If a technology is expensive, if it serves only luxury markets, if it depends on rare materials or specialized skills, it can disappear when economic conditions change, when fashions shift, when wealthy patrons lose interest. Hero's devices were clever, but not necessary. The Antikythera mechanism was fascinating, but not essential. When the conditions that produced them changed, they vanished. A fourth pattern concerns recovery. Some lost technologies have been recovered, but the process is often difficult and incomplete. We have recreated Greek fire, or at least we have created incendiaries that match the descriptions of its effects. But we cannot be certain our formulas match the original, because the original was a closely guarded secret whose composition was never fully recorded. We have recreated Damascus steel, or something very close to it, but only by using modern metallurgy and electron microscopy to analyze surviving blades and understand their structure at the microscopic level. Ancient smiths achieved similar results through experience and tradition, but their methods were different from ours, and we may never fully understand exactly how they worked. Some technologies have been partially recovered through experimental archaeology, scholars trying to recreate ancient techniques using ancient tools and methods. Experimental archaeologists have built Greek triremes to understand ancient naval warfare, have recreated Roman concrete to test its properties, have forged bronze weapons to understand ancient metallurgy. These experiments can be remarkably informative, but they also reveal how much we do not know. Even when we succeed in recreating an ancient artifact, we cannot be sure we are using the same methods the ancients used, because there are often multiple ways to achieve similar results. And some technologies may never be recovered. Flexible glass, if it was real, is probably lost forever. We do not know what it was made of, do not know how it was produced, have no surviving examples to analyze. It exists only in literary accounts, and literary accounts are notoriously unreliable about technical matters. We may never know whether flexible glass was real or legendary, possible or impossible. Let us consider now what these patterns tell us about our own technological present. We live in an age of unprecedented technological capability, with vast databases of information, with scientific knowledge published and accessible, with manufacturing processes documented and standardized. Surely, we might think, we are immune to the kind of knowledge loss that plagued ancient civilizations. But are we? Consider that much modern technology depends on extremely complex supply chains and specialized expertise. The semiconductor industry requires facilities costing billions of dollars, materials sourced from around the world, and expertise concentrated in a few companies and countries. If those supply chains were disrupted, if those companies failed, if that expertise was lost, could we rebuild the capability? How long would it take? Or consider that much modern knowledge exists in formats that may not be accessible in the future. Digital data depends on hardware and software that quickly becomes obsolete. Files created 20 years ago may already be difficult to open because the programs that created them no longer exist. How will historians 1,000 years from now access our digital archives, assuming those archives survive at all? The ancients at least carved their knowledge in stone or wrote it on parchment, durable media that can be read as long as the language is understood. Our knowledge exists on magnetic media that degrades, in file formats that require specific software, on websites that can disappear when a company goes out of business or forgets to renew a domain name. We may be creating a dark age of the future simply by storing our knowledge in such ephemeral forms. Moreover, we face the same challenges of tacit knowledge that the ancients faced. Much modern manufacturing depends on skilled workers whose knowledge is not fully documented, craftsmen who can tune complex machinery by sound, engineers who can diagnose problems through experience and intuition, technicians who know the quirks of specific equipment. This knowledge is not in manuals or databases. It lives in people's heads and hands, and if we do not create systems to transmit it, it will be lost just as surely as the knowledge of Damascus steel smiths was lost. There is also the question of purpose and context. Technologies are developed and maintained because they serve some need, because there are economic or social reasons to keep them alive. If those reasons disappear, the technologies may disappear too, regardless of how sophisticated or useful they might be. The ancient world developed many technologies that were lost not because of catastrophe, but simply because no one saw sufficient reason to maintain them. What technologies might we be losing right now, not through disaster, but through neglect? What skills and knowledge might be fading because they are no longer economically viable, because fewer people are learning them, because the contexts that sustained them are disappearing? Traditional crafts, indigenous knowledge, specialized manufacturing techniques, these are all vulnerable to the same forces that claimed ancient technologies. The story of forgotten inventions is not just a story about the past. It is a warning about the fragility of knowledge, about how easily sophisticated capabilities can be lost, about how much we depend on context and transmission and continued practice to maintain our technological civilization. Every technology we have examined was created by intelligent, skilled people working within flourishing civilizations, and yet their achievements were lost, leaving later generations to rediscover what had already been known. As we conclude this journey through forgotten workshops and lost laboratories, perhaps the most important lesson is humility. We should not assume that knowledge, once gained, is permanent. We should not take for granted the technologies we possess. We should recognize that maintaining knowledge requires effort. It requires teaching, requires practice, requires institutions that support transmission across generations. The ancient inventors we have met, the creators of the Antikythera mechanism, Zhang Heng with his seismoscope, Hero with his steam engine, the smiths who forged Damascus steel, the builders who mixed Roman concrete, they were not primitives working with limited understanding. They were sophisticated engineers and craftsmen working at the frontiers of what was possible in their times, creating technologies that in some cases would not be matched for over 1,000 years. Their knowledge was lost not because it was inferior, but because knowledge is fragile, because transmission is difficult, because contexts change and skills are forgotten. If it happened to them, in their civilizations with their achievements, it can happen to us. The question is not whether we are vulnerable to knowledge loss, we are, but what we are doing to prevent it, how we are preserving not just the artifacts and texts of our technology, but the tacit knowledge, the practical wisdom, the embodied skills that make technology actually work. The forgotten inventions of antiquity are not just curiosities from the past. They are mirrors reflecting our own vulnerability, reminders that progress is not inevitable, that knowledge must be actively maintained and transmitted, that every generation stands on the shoulders of those who came before, and must consciously choose to preserve what they have inherited and pass it on to those who will come after. Let us hope we prove wiser than those who let the secrets of Greek fire burn out, than those who forgot how to forge Damascus steel, than those who lost the formula for Roman concrete. Let us hope that our descendants, centuries or millennia from now, will not look back on our achievements the way we look back on the Antikythera mechanism, with wonder and puzzlement, trying to understand how we did what we did, struggling to recreate what we once knew, lamenting the loss of knowledge that seemed, in its time, so solid and permanent, but proved in the end as fragile as everything else human hands create.